Hello and welcome to today's Dorset Council Local Plan webinar on all things environmental. Our speakers today are Millie Rose, Planning Policy Officer, Sue Bellamy, Senior Planning Policy Officer, and Annabelle King, Senior Ecologist. I'm Councillor David Walsh, Portfolio Holder for Planning at Dorset Council and one of 3 ward councillors for the Gillingham area. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you of a few housekeeping points that will help you get the most out of this session. The speaker's presentation will run for approximately 20-25 minutes. Following this, we will answer the questions that have been received. Any further questions will either be answered on our website or, if applicable, at a different webinar. Go to www.dorsetcouncil.gov.uk and search Dorset Council Local Plan webinars for more details. If you lose connection to the session, then please try rejoining. You may want to ensure your Wi-Fi is at an optimum level by disconnecting all other devices from the Wi-Fi. So, you might be wondering what a local plan is and why it is so important. This local plan time sets out the future of Dorset until 2038. That is a 17-year timescale. That isn't huge. It's very important. It outlines the strategy for the growth Dorset needs. So housing, jobs, shops, community services, such as schools, are in the right places and are of the right character. It also helps to protect our unique environment and acts to help alleviate our impacts on the climate. To help plan for you, your children's and your grandchildren's future, we need you to get involved. Go to www.dorsetcouncil.gov.uk, Dorset Council Local Plan, for more details, because you can help and we need your assistance. This particular webinar sets out how the planning team have shaped the local plan to help Dorset pay its part in lowering emissions, how we plan on adapting to flooding, and how we can protect our unique environment. I'll now hand over to the first speaker, Annabelle, our lead ecologist, to help us understand more about these proposals.
Hi everyone, thanks David. As has been said, I'm Annabelle King and I'm the Natural Environment Team Leader at Dorset Council, and here today with Sue and Millie, and we're really pleased to have the opportunity to share this part of the draft local plan with you, and we're happy to answer any questions. I also wanted to say that the webinar is an overview of the environment section of the plan, so do have a read through of the relevant chapters to find out more detail. So we're going to start with the overriding issue of climate change. There is clear scientific evidence to show that climate change is happening and is due to human activity. This includes increases in average global temperatures and greater risk of flooding, droughts and heat waves, not to mention the impact on biodiversity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates that the majority of the globe has experienced an increase in average temperature in recent years. We're starting to see the impact of this, which represents a real threat to us all, and Dorset Council has a responsibility to play its part in helping tackle this growing danger while we can and still make a difference. So in response to climate change, at its very first full council meeting back in May 2019, the council took the bold step of declaring a climate and ecological emergency. We're committed to take action to reduce our environmental impact and help our communities to do the same. Dorset Council is also working on a climate and ecological emergency strategy and action plan alongside its partners. Many of the measures in the local plan to adapt to and mitigate climate change will also assist in protecting the natural environment and biodiversity, to mitigate human impacts on Dorset's sensitive habitats and wildlife, and on the environmental economy, which is vital to Dorset. In 2019, the UK became the first major economy in the world to pass laws within the amended Climate Change Act of 2008 to end its contribution to global warming by 2050, requiring greenhouse gas emissions to be brought to net zero by this date. The UK government has recently gone further to aim to reduce 1990 emissions by 68% by 2030, faster than any other major economy. The local plan is an important council document in the fight against climate change as it will influence all future development in Dorset for the next 70 years. And I'm going to hand over to Millie.
Thank you, Annabelle. Yes, I'm now going to talk about climate change more specifically within the local plan. So considerations of climate change run like a thread throughout the plan, and we've identified several key themes from the Dorset Council Climate and Ecological Emergency Strategy and Action Plan that the local plan can help to work towards. So just to summarise what I'm going to run through now, the local plan can direct development to the most sustainable locations to reduce travel, support renewable energy projects, support sustainable travel initiatives, including active travel modes such as walking and cycling and the railways. It can provide full fibre superfast broadband to all new premises, incorporate biodiversity, net gain and green infrastructure into new developments, and it can strengthen the resilience of communities to key hazards. So the following slides look in more detail as to the specific climate and ecological emergency measures incorporated in the plan. Going on firstly to the development strategy. So essential objective of the local plan is to deliver just over 30,000 new homes in Dorset in sustainable locations over the 17 years until the end of the plan period. So for this reason, we first looked to the towns and built up areas within the top 2 tiers of the settlement hierarchy as potential locations for housing and employment growth. And this has the aim of reducing travel and associated vehicle emissions by concentrating development near to the largest existing centres of services, facilities and employment. So if you want to hear more about this, you can tune into our development strategy webinar or podcast on our local plan website. Moving on to renewable energy and energy use. If we could just go, to the next slide, thank you. So energy use is a large contributor to climate change, and increasing the amount of renewable sources we use for our energy supply is key to slow climate change and ensure that the UK has a secure energy supply. So in simple terms, renewable energy is the energy obtained from natural processes that's replenished more rapidly than it's consumed. Currently in Dorset, about 5.5% of the energy we use is from renewable energy sources, but there's the potential to do much more. So the local plan supports new renewable energy schemes, such as solar farms that are sensitively placed and avoid environmental, amenity and heritage impacts. We're also looking more deeply into the potential for Dorset to provide wind energy development and have identified some suitable sites. So provided that these have community backing and the planning issues associated with them can be resolved, and we think they could go a long way to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from Dorset. I'm going now to talk about the built environment, which has been identified that use of buildings in the UK accounts for around 35% of greenhouse gas emissions, and approximately 2/3 of this from residential properties, and a significant amount from construction of new buildings. So to combat this, the environmental performance of larger developments will be assessed through a nationally recognised assessment process, and each individual building will be subject to building regulations. Further considerations that the local plan supports can involve installation of solar panels, maximising natural light and ventilation, minimising overshadowing to reduce the requirement for heating, and avoiding materials which are the most harmful to the environment. Going on to transport, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, has identified transport as contributing 23% of emissions in the UK. The local plan aims to reduce vehicle travel by encouraging more active modes of travel than just by private car, including walking and cycling. This will be achieved by locating the majority of growth in places with good sustainable transport links and access to jobs and services, thereby reducing the need to travel by private car. Support will also be given to layouts of new development that encourage walking and cycling between facilities, open spaces and the countryside where possible, and provision of infrastructure to support this. In July 2018, the government set out its ambition that at least half of new cars would be ultra-low emission by 2030 to help towards the ban of all new petrol and diesel vehicles from 2040. The planning process provides a mechanism to assist in the delivery of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The need for infrastructure for electric and other ultra-low emission vehicles is growing to meet the changing transport requirements and technologies. Therefore, we're proposing that all relevant developments should include the necessary infrastructure to facilitate the increase in take-up of electric and ultra-low emission vehicles. What this means in a bit more detail is that car parking spaces should basically have the necessary underlying infrastructure in place to enable simple installation of a charging point in the future, and at least 20% of parking spaces in major development have fully wired, connected and ready to use charging points. Many people may ask us, why not 100% of parking spaces providing electric vehicle charging? And this is simply because there are so many competing priorities, both within climate change and other considerations in the plan, including the need for affordable housing, that constrain this figure and mean that the viability at present can't go any further. So onto full fibre broadband. This will be installed to all new premises. The aim of this is to enable more people to work from home or for businesses to work more efficiently in rural locations, then reducing the need to travel further and producing less emissions from vehicle travel. Finally, the last major consideration within the climate change section is also strengthening the resilience to key hazards which are projected to increase as a result of climate change, including flooding, coastal erosion and extreme weather events too. Flooding, as we know, presents a significant risk to people and property, and climate change, and more specifically rising sea levels and changes to the pattern and intensity of rainfall brought by climate change, is likely to have an effect on areas subject to flooding in Dorset in the coming years. The risks of flooding have been taken into account when selecting appropriate sites for development, and development will be guided towards the areas of lowest flood risk now and also in the future, making allowances for climate change. Development will also support high quality SUDs or sustainable urban drainage systems, which sustainably manage rainfall and reduce flooding impacts while contributing to on-site biodiversity. So that's everything from me on the specifics on climate change and the local plan. I will now pass you over to Sue and Annabelle, who are going to speak more about green infrastructure and biodiversity.
Thanks, Millie. We'll move on to green infrastructure to start with. Green infrastructure incorporates a range of spaces and assets that provides environmental and wider benefits. These range from children's playgrounds to informal green space and natural and semi-natural green space, and from sustainable drainage features to cycleways. The plan summarises them and gives them local examples. These benefits are often known as ecosystem services and can include improved well-being, improved outdoor recreation and access through enhanced rights of way and cycle routes along with it, enhancements to and linkages between biodiversity and landscapes, food and energy production, and can address climate change through urban cooling, reduced air pollution, excuse me, and the management of flood risk, which Millie mentioned earlier. Individual pieces of green infrastructure will all have a primary function, but many can serve more than one purpose, especially if designed with this in mind. For example, a SUD scheme can provide biodiversity benefits and urban cooling, as well as flood attenuation. A number of strategic sites have been identified in the plan, and developers will be expected to provide or contribute to the provision and long-term maintenance of local and strategic green infrastructure. Just passing briefly on to Annabelle for a few minutes.
Thanks, Sue. Just taking a quick look at protected habitats and species. In declaring a climate and ecological emergency, Dorset Council also recognises the huge decline in biodiversity and the importance of protecting and enhancing the natural environment to reverse this decline. There are a huge number of wildlife sites across the Dorset Council Local Plan area, which is designated for their importance on an international, national and local level. So I'm just going to list them. Dorset has 17 special areas of conservation, including 2 marine, 5 special protection areas, including 1 marine, and 4 Ramsar wetland sites. And together, these are part of the National Sites Network, which contributes to the wider Natura 2000 network. In addition, Dorset is home to 134 sites of special scientific interest, 12 national nature reserves and 9 marine conservation zones, as well as 1,245 county wildlife sites or sites of nature conservation interest and 28 local nature reserves. In many cases, some of these designations overlap. So for instance, SPAs and SACs could also be national nature reserves and will definitely be sites of special scientific interest as well. And you can just see from that just how many different designations and sites we have to think about. So in terms of land coverage, approximately 12% of Dorset, and that's not including the area of outstanding natural beauty, is covered by a designated site, whether through national or local legislation and policy. And of course, Dorset is also home to many rare and threatened protected species, and that includes all 6 species of UK reptile, for example, sand lizards and smooth snakes, and all 17 species of bats that are listed on the 2020 UK Red List for mammals. So we're just going to look at some of the designated sites in more detail in terms of their mitigation, and I'm going to hand back to Sue.
Thanks, Annabelle. We'll just move on to a little bit more detail on some of the sites, as Annabelle said. Heathlands are a particular example of internationally protected sites, and they do face particular issues as a result of development. It's been known for some time that these sites are particularly sensitive to developments, especially the impact of recreation. They are also sensitive to nitrogen deposition from a number of sources, including traffic emissions, the worst area affected being within 200 metres of a busy road. The Council has adopted the Dorset Heathlands Planning Framework Supplementary Planning Document, or SPD, and that identifies how the Council and developers can address these impacts. The Council is working jointly with neighbouring Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council to develop an interim air quality strategy to improve the condition of the heathlands. This interim strategy will be developed into a supplementary planning document in due course. Moving on to look at the sort of spread of the heathland sites, the Dorset Heaths collectively are made up of several different designated areas, largely concentrated in the southeast of the county. Within a 400-metre buffer around the heathland, certain forms of development are not permitted. Between 400 metres and 5 kilometres from the designated heath, development will only be permitted where it avoids or mitigates the impact upon the heathland sites. For large-scale development, impacts may be avoided through direct provision of what collectively are termed Heathland Infrastructure Projects, or HIPs. For smaller scale development, the mitigation may be delivered through financial contributions towards appropriate HIPs. The Heathland Infrastructure Projects are designed to reduce recreational pressure on protected heathland sites. These provide alternative recreational opportunities for residents, thereby reducing the pressure on the heaths. In many cases, this is through a suitable alternative natural green space, or SANG. The first example of a SANG in the Dorset Council area is, by the way, field near Wimborne, which some of you may be aware of and even use. And other examples include French's Farm SANG at Upton. So the pressure on the heaths can also be reduced by what we call heathland support areas adjacent to protected sites. There is a series of existing SANGs and heathland support areas already in place across the area, and a number of proposed SANGs and heathland support areas, most of which are associated with large development sites. It's not just SANGs that we may use, but other types of HIPs may be appropriate. For example, where the recreational pressure on the heath is mainly from BMX uses, In this case, it may be appropriate to provide an alternative site for people to enjoy their riding, as at Potton Park. The council also funds projects which work with people to encourage responsible behaviour when visiting heaths, including general engagement through wardening, but also more focused work with young people to reduce the incidences of arson. To address the damaging nitrogen deposition on heaths in the short term, this will include active management on the heathlands, but the local plan will also include policies to address the more problematic longer term issues, for example, by enabling more electric vehicle ownership and reducing the nitrogen deposition that way. I'm just going to hand back to Annabelle, and she'll pick up some of the other issues.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, just briefly looking at other issues that we are dealing with through the local plan. So air quality and recreation concerns have also been raised on sites in the north of Dorset, and these include several SACs, so Rooksmoor SAC, Cerne and Sidling Downs SAC, sorry, I should have said that, Special Area of Conservation, and also Fontmell and Melbury Downs SAC, north of Blandford. And these are all being addressed with the help of Natural England as part of the local plan process. Back to you, I think, Sue.
Back to me, thank you, Annabelle. When we're back in the southeast of Dorset again, back to Poole Harbour. Poole Harbour is designated as a special protection area and Ramsar site, as it's an important breeding and migratory bird area. The harbour is sensitive to nitrogen inputs from several sources within the catchment area, which causes the build-up of algal mats on the mudflats, and that prevents the birds from feeding properly. Recreational activities in and around the harbour also impact on birds by reducing their breeding success. Dorset Council has, in partnership with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council and Natural England, adopted 2 supplementary planning documents addressing the impacts of nitrogen inputs and recreation in the harbour. The nitrogen reduction in Poole Harbour SPD requires new development within the hydrological catchment of the harbour to be nitrogen neutral, so that it does not contribute additional nitrogen to the harbour. The Poole Harbour Recreation SPD addresses the need to avoid or mitigate harm arising from increased levels of leisure activities on the protected features of Poole Harbour. Mitigation measures currently focus on effective management of the site, particularly influencing the behaviour of users of the harbour, and that's funded by development within an identified zone of influence. Water quality is not just an issue within Poole Harbour, it's been raised recently in other areas, and there's now too many nutrients in water in the river catchments that cover other parts of Dorset. Excess phosphates, for example, are causing concern in the River Avon and the River Axe special areas of conservation, which flank either side of the council area, and in the northwest Dorset, which drains into the Somerset Levels and Moors special protection area. The council is investigating these issues and developing strategies in partnership with Natural England to address the problems. And another coastal area where we have concerns is Chesil Beach and the Fleet. Mitigation is required here to allow development to take place without leading to effect on Chesil Beach and the Fleet. Natural England have recently provided evidence which suggests that recreation pressure at Chesil Beach and the Fleet is adversely affecting the internationally important habitats and species at the site. So the Dorset Council is working to produce the Chesil and Fleet SPD, which will set out how development must contribute financially to mitigation measures. In the meantime, to ensure development can take place, an interim strategy has been adopted to fund a wardening service at the site. The regulations which protect the sites also give protection to a number of species found in Dorset. This includes all species of bat, great crested newt, sand lizard and smooth snake, otter and dormouse, among others. The local plan sets out how impact on these species must be avoided or minimised, mitigated and, as a last resort, compensated for. On that note, I'm going to hand you back to Annabelle, and she's going to go through in detail a little bit more on the biodiversity that's outlined in the Dorset plan.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, so in addition to mitigating the specific impacts identified on designated international sites, we're also required through the National Planning Policy Framework and Guidance to maintain and enhance biodiversity. The Council uses the mitigation hierarchy to help achieve this. So primarily development should avoid adverse impact on biodiversity, and then where impacts can't be avoided, for example through alternative location or design, then mitigation measures must be put in place in order to reduce the impact. Where this is not possible, then any losses must be met off-site through biodiversity compensation, alongside enhancements to ensure a net gain in biodiversity is always achieved. The Environment Bill strengthens this by making provisions for targets, plans and policies for improving the natural environment. These include minimum 10% biodiversity net gain, a nature recovery network, and local nature recovery strategies, which will include a habitat map based on our existing ecological network maps. And the existing ecological network maps can be found on the Local Nature Partnership website or indeed on Dorset Explorer. The local plan translates the targets and actions from the Environment Bill into planning policy to ensure that development in Dorset will comply with emerging legislation. And then moving on just to focus on one particular way in which we deal with impacts on biodiversity, and that is the Dorset Biodiversity Appraisal Protocol. So to meet our obligations from legislation and policy, including the Council's biodiversity duty under the NERC Act, we operate something known as the Dorset Biodiversity Appraisal Protocol, incorporating a compensation framework. This includes a set process for identifying existing biodiversity on a site, assessing the impact of development, and then identifying mitigation, compensation, and net gain. The Biodiversity Protocol is being updated to take account of the measures set out in the Environment Bill, including achieving a minimum of 10% net gain from each development, and also use of conservation covenants to secure this. So you can see from this that we're trying to future-proof the draft local plan. And then moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to say a little bit more about net gain and the nature recovery network. So the requirement for 10% net gain set out in the Environment Bill means that development must leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. In Dorset, the focus for this will be on the restoration and recreation of priority and locally important habitats, and the protection and recovery of priority species, and measures to enhance the existing and potential ecological network. Dorset Environmental Records Centre produce regularly updated ecological network maps of the potential and the existing ecological network. Developers are expected to use these maps and the sites identified as strategic green infrastructure such as Stour Valley Park and Portland Quarries Nature Park to identify opportunities for habitat compensation if required and for net gain. And this will help increase connectivity of Dorset's network of wildlife-rich habitats, and it will help ensure that the ecological network delivers a wide range of ecosystem services, such as improvements to health and well-being, flood risk management, and carbon sequestration. So that's all from Sue and Millie and myself, and I just wanted to hand back to Councillor Walsh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle and Sue and Millie. That was fascinating. So thank you all for your presentations. I was especially pleased to hear that the local plan and the climate and ecological emergency strategy and action plan are working together, hand in glove. The local plan is an important council document in the fight against climate change, as it will influence all future development in Dorset for the next 17 years, as you've heard. As Annabelle said in her presentation, considerations of climate change run like a thread throughout the plan. And we have identified several key themes from the Dorset Council Climate and Ecological Emergency Strategy and Action Plan that the local plan can help towards, starting with directing development to the most sustainable locations to reduce travel, and aiming to reduce vehicle travel by encouraging more active modes of travel than private cars, and other ways that we have heard of today. Well, this morning I spoke to Councillor Ray Bryan, who is the portfolio holder leading on climate change. And though the public consultation on the action plan has finished, he told me that anyone wanting to input into the consultation can still fill in the shortened version on the website, or contact him personally, and he will ensure that your comments are still taken on board. We need as many comments as possible on both of these consultations, because I cannot think of anything more important in these issues than the local plan for Dorset and climate change. So thank you again. We've had plenty of questions, so if all of the speakers could turn their microphones and videos on, I'll get started. Do we build in flood zones?
I'll pick that one up if you're okay with that one. Flood risk is one of the main environmental constraints we have, and the council follows what's called a sequential test, and that means that it steers new development to areas with the lowest probability of flooding. Now the council is preparing what we call a level 1 risk assessment, and that includes foreground sources, whether it's river, coast. Now the assessment will also take account of climate change by identifying those areas that are likely to be increased risk of flooding in the future. We have ruled out proposals for residential development in what we call flood zones 2 and 3. They're the areas most likely to flood. Plymouth Town regeneration, a more detailed level of flood, I don't know if I said that earlier, will be prepared to identify the risks for the development of these important brownfield sites. So when planning applications for the larger sites are submitted, they are also expected to be accompanied by a site-specific flood risk assessment.
Thank you very much, Sue. Very comprehensive answer. Millie, what is a sustainable urban drainage system?
Thank you, David. Yeah, so good question. Sustainable urban drainage systems are often referred to as SUDs. They're drainage systems that are considered to be environmentally beneficial because their installation can provide multiple benefits. So development, especially of greenfield sites, often alters the natural drainage processes that occur when rain falls on land and vegetation. And this can lead to surface water flooding, erosion and pollution, but sustainable urban drainage systems work to combat this. They can involve green roofs, permeable paving, installation of trees, detention ponds and soakaways, and can be delivered as part of both greenfield or brownfield development. And they can provide an opportunity to help deliver sustainable development by not only reducing flooding, but also the green measures can help to provide multifunctional benefits like climate change mitigation, enhancing green infrastructure, and contributing to net gains in biodiversity as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Millie. And another one from you, and this is something I hear quite frequently.
Yeah.
Why can't the plan require heat pumps and solar panels on all new houses?
Okay, so firstly, I think we briefly touched on a similar question within the presentation when I was talking about electric vehicle charging points and viability constraints. So the viability of development is constrained by a number of factors, both within climate change and other considerations in the plan. I think, like I said before, affordable housing, but also infrastructure requirements, to name a few. As well as this, a further consideration is the implications of requiring certain technologies on building regulations. So building regulations regulate the efficiency of buildings, and requiring heat pumps and solar panels might reduce the efficiency of the building material that developer uses. And developers may also challenge the requirement for heat pumps and solar panels on sites, which might have implications for our housing delivery in the area. In other circumstances, it's also useful to think about how there might be other considerations within planning. So, for example, one example is solar panels. To be most effective, their orientation requires them to be facing the south so that they can receive the most amount of light throughout the day. But this orientation requirement might not align with other considerations in the development and specific considerations for the site. So, for example, a site might need to be laid out to accommodate the setting of a heritage feature or to relate to an access, which might mean that the street layout isn't optimum for solar panels, for example. So, yeah, there's lots of considerations to take into account.
Thank you very much, Millie. Sue, can the plan insist on the retrofitting of old houses?
Thank you, David. The planning system actually can't insist that old houses are retrofitted to reduce their environmental footprint. It's only when the permission for change of use is needed or building regulations is required for an operation that an old house can be brought up to current standards. Additional opportunities can be encouraged when the owners of existing homes have to engage with either the development management or building regulations team, but work can't be insisted on. There's also an additional consideration sometimes, for example, where listed buildings or buildings in conservation areas are involved, then there is the added complexity of making sure that improvements do not detract from the heritage value of the building. This may be covered in more detail in the webinar on the 4th of February, which looks at the heritage and landscape issues that we have to consider. So if you're interested in the design and heritage and landscape, then the 4th of February is a date for your diary.
Thank you very much, Sue, for that answer and for the plug. Thank you. Annabelle, does the mitigation put in place to protect biodiversity really work?
That is a really good question, and I know it's one that we as planners and local government ecologists often wrestle with. Firstly, there are different kinds of mitigation. There's mitigation for impacts on designated sites, as we've already said, and that's often through collection of SIL and Section 106 monies, as set out in our adopted supplementary planning documents. And then there's also mitigation for impacts on protected species in priority habitats, which is set out in Dorset through use of the Dorset Biodiversity Appraisal Protocol. So for designated sites, monitoring the effectiveness of mitigation on these sites, for example, a suitable alternative natural green space, is done by the council, or for heathland mitigation by partners, including the Urban Heath Partnership and Footprint Ecology. And we are working on this at the moment, analysing the data to make sure that the policies in the draft plan are backed up by the latest analysis of all the data that we've been collecting. In other words, to make sure that the mitigation is really working. So we are constantly checking this and constantly asking that question. And mitigation for impacts on protected species is set out in a biodiversity plan or a landscape and ecological management plan. And these documents are conditioned through the Dorset Biodiversity Appraisal Protocol if the development is consented. And this means that the mitigation measures can be checked at an enforcement visit after the development has started, or by looking online and comparing what you see on the ground as a member of public with what's in the documentation online. And the mitigation that we require from developers is all set out in various technical guidance documents which are written by experts on those species, so we can be confident that once the mitigation is put in place, it will work.
Thank you very much indeed for that answer. Thank you. And one again for you, Annabelle. When do we expect the environmental bill to become law and developers need to meet the new requirements?
Yes, so the Environment Bill has already been mentioned in this webinar and is a piece of forthcoming legislation. So it is worth mentioning that some things in the Environment Bill, such as the requirement for biodiversity net gain, are already in national planning policy and guidance, and developers should expect to include this already in their applications now, but in the knowledge that from 2023, when the Environment Bill becomes law, this will be set out in more detail and with a minimum net gain of 10% rather than no set target. Also, the Environment Bill sets out the requirement for local nature recovery strategies, which will include a local habitat map showing where the best opportunities for habitat creation are within Dorset. And although we won't legally be required to have a local nature recovery strategy until 2023, we already have an ecological networks map for Dorset, which does a similar job. And the need for development to have regard to this is already included in national and local policy. So back to the Environment Bill, it is currently going through Parliament and has just finished the committee stage in the House of Commons. At the same time, a whole raft of secondary legislation, such as net gain plans, conservation covenants, and the biodiversity metric, which is the way that people will work out the detail of how much net gain their development is providing, are being worked on so that they are ready in time. The latest update from DEFRA and Natural England, I think, is that the bill will become law through an amendment of the Town and Country Planning Act in late spring 2023. And at that point, it will be a legal requirement for developers to meet the new requirements. But the biodiversity metric to calculate net gain will be ready for use this spring, and there is an expectation that developers will use it from that point onwards. And the National Net Gain Credit Register will be ready for use in 2022.
Thank you very much indeed, Annabelle. And I'm pleased that when these are finally recorded, people will be able to play them back numerous times because so much information has been delivered today. It's been fantastic, so thank you. So just a reminder, any questions we didn't get time for will be answered either at an applicable webinar or on our website within 2 weeks, along with a recorded presentation. Have a look at our webpage for more information on other webinars or podcasts if you're interested in other subjects. So I'd just like to say thank you again and goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.